Hello, and welcome to the Product Insiders LinkedIn Live series, in which we interview product leaders and learn how they leverage customer insights to navigate tough product decisions. I'm your host, Zach Lyons, managing partner of Agile Innovation Advisors. Look, if you're joining us live today, can you please enter where you are from in the chat so we know who is with us? We really do appreciate that. Today, our special guest is Steven Coen, CEO of SaRA Health. And we'll be asking Steven some questions, but if you have any specific questions for him, please enter them in the chat and we'll get to them in a bit. So with that, let's begin. Steven, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
I'm so glad you were able to find the time. I know you're busy. So I'll jump right in with my first question. And thinking about a tough product decision that you've had to navigate, can you please tell us about your role at the time and the situation?
Absolutely. And not to bury the lead, but we end up killing an entire portion of our product as a part of it. As CEO of a small, at that time, sub 10-person startup, was de facto product manager as well. And what we were selling, what we continue to deliver is patient engagement in between visits for physical therapy, and focused on this one niche of physical therapy practice serving primarily firefighters and police officers. And what we found was we weren't getting the engagement we wanted or thought we could get. In fact, it was once out of every 3 days, which, if you know anything about the fire service, means they were logging in to our web app at the time when they were on shift. And the physical therapy groups we were contracted with were like, hey, this isn't enough. Like, it's not enough. We're not seeing the compliance we need to see to deliver the better outcomes. Like, basically, you guys need to do better. And so that was the push that led us to making a pretty extreme change to our product, and one that I am so thankful we did, and has created now where I think on average we're getting about 65% daily engagement for patients on our system.
Gotcha. So before we jump into that, which now I'm itching to hear about, can you tell us, maybe just for people who aren't familiar with SaRA Health, just a little bit about the product, or at least the mission of what you were looking to accomplish back then when you launched the product?
Absolutely. Yeah, and so we have had a major insurance shift during our company. So, which we could talk about a little bit. The core of the mission has always been the same. So SaRA stands for your Strength and Resilience Assistant. So we're here to help build stronger and more resilient patients and practices. And how do we believe we can do that? By bridging the gap in between visits for patients, right? So I'm not a clinician, I'm a frustrated patient. And I always found it so stinking frustrating how it felt like recovery started and stopped in the clinic. Like, why does it have to be this way? It shouldn't have to be. Let's go fix it. And so the founding team was myself. So on the business and tech side, I had launched a tech company prior and worked at Deloitte Consulting, where I launched multiple tech-enabled services through Deloitte Consulting. My CTO, who had spent time at Box, Goldman Sachs, and he was getting his master's in computer science from UCLA, which is where we met. So, go Bruins on that front. It was a happy Anderson grad. And that's what this came out of. And then our third co-founder, Paul, he's a doctor of physical therapy and has spent about a decade at the Mayo Clinic. So you had the trifecta, right, of business, tech, and clinical all together. And we've always been about solving the problem of how can we get people more connected to their therapist in between visits? And in 2022, we took a pretty dramatic shift with the insurance starting to cover basically what we did. We're like, where y'all been? We've been doing this for 5 years. We know it helps. We've been the beneficiary of a policy shift, and really enjoyed the time since then.
So it sounds like you had a dream team and you had a clear problem, which was patients getting therapy. I guess that could be like physical therapy or occupational therapy, going into a session, right? That 30, 45-minute session or whatever the case may be, and then going home, but not then making progress, right? Having more exercises to do. I know I've done physical therapy a number of times in my life, and I know how important it is to do the physical exercises in between sessions to get the benefit of the therapy. So you saw that as a problem, and you launched a product that, as you said, you were seeing people only logging in once every 3 days. So tell us a little about this challenge that you saw, the issue, and then what was difficult about navigating that?
The issue was that, right? It was 33% daily engagement was just not acceptable. And so that was it. And it also, we found that we were like having to like hack our web app to be able to get data points that were really important to the physical therapist, right? So, home exercise data is great, right? That's great. Like, oh, did you do 3 sets of 5 or you did 4 sets of 5? But what we found was that through further research that, and even our own lived experience, is that you go into the clinic for your visit, and it might not be, hey, Zach, did you do home exercises? Like, that might be a question, but it might be, hey, Zach, how was that flight on Tuesday? Right? Oh, well, I didn't think to log that. And we started seeing all this, like, there's a bunch of other data points that are really valuable to the clinical decision-making process that we're not capturing, nor is this really a good medium to do it. And so we started to kind of have like that, almost like the voice in the back of your head be like, there might be something else here, right? And so those combining forces led us on the path of further research. So talking to a lot of the firefighters that we were blessed enough to be able to serve through our physical therapist group customers. And I'll never forget this interview with Danielle from Plainfield Fire, and a bit of a bout of frustration around her, like, you know what, like, I'm not going to get on my husband's computer to log into this. Like, I know how to do my exercises. I'm not going to do it. I'll do it. I'm in the firehouse because it's pulled up on the firehouse computers, and like, it's really easy, and I'll do that. And so, in a bit of a bout of frustration, it's like, well, would you respond to a text? And she's like, well, it better be a good text. I'm like, okay, we're on to something. And that was the beginning of the journey that ultimately ended with us killing the web app entirely on the patient side. So now, as a patient, when you interact with SaRA, there is no web application. It is purely text messages. And we found that, and done our own research, that we, even without the web app, which we thought was required, right? Like, oh, you got to have that. Like, you got to be able to track your home exercises. Like, sets and reps really matter. We're like, not nearly as much as compliance. And so patients are saying that on average, I believe it's 61% of our patients report higher compliance due to the text messages. But it's also, what we're finding is the perceived value of therapy is much higher. So 81% of patients on SaRA report that they have a higher perception of the value of therapy as a result of those check-ins and creating that access in between visits. And so, is it the text messages being reminders to do your exercises, or the increase in the perceived value that now, if I see something that's more valuable, I'm going to invest more in it, right? Almost like the social contract. Right. We're not sure which, but it probably a little bit of A, a little bit of B.
So I'm curious. So you got that comment from the frustrated firefighter that she wasn't logging in at home because just the context was in the right scenario, but doing it at the firehouse, which obviously is not frequent enough. Did you validate that insight with others? Like, how did you go from like that one point of person mentioning something? I'm curious kind of how you expanded and actually landed on then texting is the way to go.
We did some additional research and figured out there's a couple companies that at the time were in the remote patient monitoring space. So we do remote therapeutic monitoring, which came out in 2022. They're doing remote patient monitoring. And we saw some really good success with those groups using text to supplement the device data that they were getting. So we're like, okay, that's interesting. And then some research that I remember from Dr. David Spiegel around the kind of funny that a patient will be more truthful with a chatbot than they will with their doctor. Right? Why? Okay. Now, granted, the context for that was a gastroenterologist, right? So you're talking about things that, bodily functions that not necessarily something you talk about globally. So maybe a little bit of bias there. But anyway, so, okay, that people respond to text messages. Okay, let's at least start piloting this and figure it out. So we started texting and asking, hey, did you do your exercises? We realized that if you ask that for about 4 days in a row, then your engagement is going to drop to less than 5%. So like, well, shoot, well, now we're worse than we were to begin with. Like, this isn't good. And so then we learned, okay, there needs to be variation in the text messages and what they're asking, not just in the actual like content, but like what the data point is. And we've just built this library of questions and knowledge, and then a whole new way to think about a way to deliver value to the therapist. And so on a set cadence, we're asking the same questions, or sorry, more specifically, asking for the same data points. So that way, as a PT, I can track your progress. Then I find that more valuable, and then it becomes this virtuous cycle where patient responds, PT acknowledges, and sends custom responses. Then patient knows that this isn't going to the ether like everything else, and now they're more effective visits, which then creates a more engaged patient, which the PT really likes because they don't want to drag anyone through it, right? Like it's much more fun to have someone that's highly engaged, right? So then, okay, like it's just this really, really cool virtuous cycle that gets created.
So it sounds like you've had to do a lot of kind of trial and error in your solution. So what you first thought, you're like, okay, let's try text, but then how do you actually implement that, right? I'm sure there's a myriad of ways of doing that, right? From, like you said, every day, annoying people, to a useful, productive set of communication. And as you were sort of thinking about this, was it purely just get something out there, throw it out and see what happens? Or did you do any kind of thinking ahead of time, planning? Like, how did you navigate this process? Because I could see this as being pretty challenging.
Yeah, at first it was just let's test this, and then when we got responses for the first couple of days, then it basically died off because our questions weren't good. That was when we came back and did a lot more work, right? I mean, that was it. Hey, will people respond? Like, for the first couple of days, yeah, like boom, 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 like getting 60, 70% response rates, fantastic, and then just boom, off a cliff, just absolutely off a cliff. Like, okay. And then we started challenging ourselves too on more the clinical relevance of the data we're collecting. So then we went back in and like, okay, we need to rethink. Like, yes, this is possible. Yes, it creates the channel. Okay, now what do we do with that? And how do we keep it lively? How do we keep it active? Is there gamification that could be in there? And so that's when we put a lot of work. So the time between realization and yes, we can, like, technologically we can put the product in place to be able to text and get responses, to where we are now, and even like from where we were then, the bulk of the work was after we figured out it could be done. Now, how do you do it well? And that's when we started going through, okay, well, what data points are really important? How could we ask this in a question that creates, that reduces friction to minimal for the patient? How do we get clinically relevant data to the clinician? How do we then, and then it's a whole other beast, right? Because then we had to start thinking about, okay, well, now we have data coming into the clinician. How do we help them even make a first stab at like what's a standard response that likely can be reviewed in a 24-hour time frame versus what's a non-standard response that needs to be reviewed much, much quicker, right? So like all of that, we saw like, okay, this kernel, I would call it a kernel. There's a kernel of this works and we can get data now, and then poof from there, right? Of, oh, well, how do we get it more reliably? Okay, well, how do we help analyze it on behalf of our clinicians so they don't get overburdened? And everything from there has been the bulk of the work for the last, call it 4.5 years.
Yeah. And it is interesting because your model, you actually have two customers, right? You have the patient, so you want engagement from them, which, a lot of products want engagement, right? Especially in the SaaS world. But then you also are serving the actual clinicians, right? So you want to be able to help them make sense of the input. And if it takes any more time or effort, I'm sure they wouldn't be interested, right? Yeah.
Gone, right? Unless, so what we've also found is in some, I think there's something, there's like a mental model that we started to adopt years ago, and now it's getting really, really crisp, is, attack that assumption you're most afraid of being wrong first. And so one of the things that we assumed was clinicians or providers would not want to spend any more time on any tool. And if it takes more time, it's a hard stop, no way. We've realized there's nuance to that they don't want to spend any administrative time. Clinical time is very, very different. If you show a clinician, hey, I'm going to get you more clinical data that you can use in these parts of your workflow so it doesn't feel like extra time. Oh, okay. Like all of it's on there, right? Hey, this produces better outcomes for your patients. Okay. Now I'm willing to trade potentially a little bit of pain here on my side as a clinician because it gets a better outcome for my patient. I'm willing to make that trade. So yeah, there's even nuance within time, right? And the willingness to take more time. It just has to be the right kind of time.
I love that. Attack your assumptions. Yeah, just because you have an assumption, go test it and figure out the nuances of it, like you guys did. That's really good insight. Yeah, people assume certain things and they see it sort of holistically, but there may be little pockets or areas where things vary, right? And you can't always assume that. So, you've had some success as a business. Well, you've navigated through this. What's been the result? Maybe just let listeners know, like, what's happened as a result, or are you still in this sort of trial and error constantly?
Oh man, we're still learning every day, every second. It feels like, we have a long way to go. We've created something that's very simple to use for patients and providers, and we're really proud of that. And we went out when these new codes came out and said, okay, we're going to be the simplest, we're going to be easiest to use that of these solutions in the market. And if we haven't achieved that, we're really darn close. A lot of our customers are saying that absolutely we have, and now it's a whole new bar that we've set for ourselves, which is how do we make this whole thing easy, right? And I think there's, to put it in maybe terms that more people would be you'd be able to relate to. There's a difference between being the best CRM and making client relationship management easy, right? And that's how we're looking at it. There's a difference between being the best RTM solution, so remote therapeutic monitoring for us, and it's very different to make remote therapeutic monitoring easy. So that's our goal, which raises the bar. I guess it gives us a lot of job security because it's going to take a lot longer for us to figure that out. But no, still feels like we're in the first 100 meters of a 1,600 meter race.
So you're helping folks actually do remote monitoring more effectively, but there's still the using of your solution, onboarding, all these things around it. Is that?
Yeah, because then you gotta bill for it. There's all things with that. Different insurances react different ways to these codes, and so you got to think about that. Even like every patient's different with each different plan. Then to do all the ROI calculations, and then some of our groups are like, well, I really like it, regardless of getting paid for this, which is great. I love that, but you've decreased my cancellation and no-show rate. Like I can justify the cost just with that. And so even thinking through that piece of like, oh, well, what is SaRA as this relationship operating system? What value is that driving? And what are the other positive externalities that we need to be cognizant of and potentially need to tie to in some way, shape, or form? So it's a lot, miles to go. And thank goodness, because it would be boring if we didn't.
That's awesome. Really, really interesting story. Well, so Steven, you've learned a lot along the journey. What, if you could do this again, what would you do differently? Like, how would you approach it? Maybe on your next startup.
Yeah, there will be another one for sure. I think it's back to the earlier comment is attacking those assumptions we hold dear fiercely. And so the assumptions that if you don't have good data to back up, but would rock your world if they were changed, like that piece of it. And so we saw, for instance, early on, we had a assumption we believed, which is that employers, especially high risk employers like fire chiefs and firefighters and fire departments, would pay a technology solution like us and be open and then push it out onto their provider network. That simply wasn't correct, and we wasted a lot of time and effort on that piece of the business. Luckily, we're able to pivot into, we just need to serve the physical therapy groups that are already serving those fire departments and police officers and other high risk employers. And if we would have attacked that 6 months prior to when we did, I think our trajectory would have been much different. And from there it was attacking that, like, we think text would be annoying, right? And so we held off from that for a while, and then figuring out, like, wait, they don't have to be, and pushing that. So yeah, I think it goes back to just what is an assumption that you've made that, if false, would rock your world. Like, that should be on your calendar first thing tomorrow, is go do that thing and test it.
Wow, that's great advice. It doesn't have to be an expensive test, right? You could go out there and learn quickly.
You learn really quickly. It's a adaptation of some advice I got when I was at Deloitte Consulting from a mentor of mine, who also ended up investing in the company when I said I wasn't coming back, which was great. It was, the first call of your day should be the call you want to make the least. And it's just an adaptation of that. Now, granted, at that time, we were doing this specific project where we're negotiating with vendors on behalf of clients that were either divesting or merging. So, like, it was a literal call, and that. But adapting that to what we're facing today is, I think that the foundational element of that advice holds true, which is that thing that you don't want to be wrong. Make sure that you're not wrong on it.
Yeah. And attack it, and maybe even break it down into like a simple step. I know it's inertia gets in the way, right? We want to procrastinate. We don't want to do something that so how can you break it down into like simple steps to start attacking and learning?
Absolutely.
I do want to see if anyone listening, I know a lot of folks end up listening to this later recorded, which is fantastic. If anyone listening live has a question, you can enter it in the chat and we'll get to it. I will also say, while we're waiting, that we can continue the conversation. Like any post on LinkedIn, you can come back to this. The video will be there. I do encourage, additional conversation through the chat. It's a great way to keep engagement up. I know Steven or I will be happy to answer questions you have. I do think, Steven, that story is fascinating. Obviously, very applicable to many folks, whether you're in a startup or a big company, right? Thinking about your product, your customer. If you have more than one customer like you guys, how do you make your life easier in really serving both of them? And taking your sort of assumptions, probably your riskiest assumptions, start attacking them, and thinking about how do you test and learn quickly. I love that. That's one thing I always love about entrepreneurs. I think the successful ones learn to do this well, right? And they almost get like a muscle for that, where they understand their assumptions and go attack them. And you've had success. So you're another case study of how entrepreneurs do that and do that well. So I don't see any. Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I don't know if I'd use the S word quite yet, but we're working on it.
Well, you're past 5 years now in business. Is that right?
Yeah. It'll be 7 in December. Yeah.
And I'm sure there's some statistic out there, right, showing the number of failures in the first couple of years. So you guys are probably already way out on the curve, I'm sure.
Well, we're hard to kill. We at least have that going for us.
I'm not seeing any live questions, which is fine. I know folks are busy during the day. Steven, I do thank you so much for sharing your story. If no questions are coming in, we can wrap it up for today. And I hope you listening, either now or later, learn at least one thing from this conversation. I know I did, and I'm actually now motivated to go test my assumptions. As I mentioned, feel free to enter questions, discussions in the chat. We can continue the conversation on LinkedIn. And also, obviously, please stay tuned for our next Product Insiders event. Again, it'll be right here on LinkedIn. And if you do have any questions about customer insights, customer needs, always happy to chat. Again, I'm Zach Lyons, your host with Agile Innovation Advisors. So take care, everyone. I hope you have a good day. And thank you, Steven.
Thank you.